Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club, and we are continuing on our reading with the Seth materials. And today we're going to do chapter 8. So here we go. Chapter 8, A Year of Testing. Seth looks into envelopes and gives Rob a few art lessons. For the next 11 months, the Seth sessions dealt mainly with the test data of one kind or another. At 9 p.m. as usual, Seth would begin with the theoretical material in which we were increasingly interested. At 10 p.m., he gave impressions for Dr. Instream, and after that, Rob gave me an envelope if there was to be such a test that evening. If we did have one of our own tests, then we would sit up after the session, trying to evaluate the results. By then, it was usually past midnight, and we would be exhausted. Although my confidence had risen with the 2 out-of-body episodes, I felt that I was putting Seth and myself on the line with each test session. I never knew whether or not we would have an envelope test. Often I was afraid of having a session for fear we'd have an envelope test and the results just would not apply. This never happened instantly, though the impressions given were not always as specific as we would have liked. Actually, I didn't care what was in the envelopes. I just wanted to know if Seth could tell us, and I wanted him to be absolutely right each time. My attitude was bound to have an effect. Now I wonder what Seth was able to do anything with me at all in those days, but most of the time he managed to do very well indeed. Here's an instance where Rob was trying to test for clairvoyance rather than telepathy. Like many others, this test had surprising results. Rob's notes show clearly the procedure he followed in choosing the test item. In my studio was a pile of old newspapers. Most of them were of the New York Times, both daily and Sunday copies. Shortly before the session, I removed a few local papers from the stack. Then, backing up from the pile, I pulled out a section without looking at it and tore off a portion of a page. I folded this behind me until I was sure it would fit between the regular double Bristol and into the double envelopes. Still, without looking at the paper I'd chosen as object, I sealed it in the envelopes. Then, with my eyes closed, I picked up the section from which the object had been taken, groped over to a floor-to-ceiling bookcase, and placed it on a high shelf where I would not see it. This procedure left me knowing only one thing about the object, that it was from some section of the New York Times, date unknown. After the experiment was over, Jane opened the envelopes containing the test object. Then I went back to the studio, and from the hidden section, I picked up the page from which the object had been torn. It turned out to be pages 11, 12 of section 1 of the Times for Sunday, November 6, 1966. Seth gave 39 impressions. Almost all of them had direct application. Here are several pertaining to the test object, grouped together for convenience. A paper item, rougher rather than smooth background. The object was a piece of newspaper, coarse newsprint rather than, say, a coated magazine paper stock. A gray view. Portions of illustrations were visible on both sides of the items, all in gray tones. Liberal giving. The words liberal discounts appear on the object. Connection with a telephone or telephone call. On one side of the item, we find no mail or phone orders, and on the other side, mail and phone orders filled, plus a long series of telephone exchange numbers. Something identical to something else, two or two of a kind. The word twin appears on the object, referring to the size of the blanket on sale. I had the strong subjective impression, however, that this was a reference to the fact that the envelope object was a part of a similar object. The above impressions refer to the test object itself. Now here are some about the page from which the object was taken. Seth said in consecutive order, a method of disposal, something in the vernacular, gubernatorial. I was after the word gubernatorial here, but as usual, Rob recorded it the way I pronounced it in trance. For a minute, this data stumped us when we went over the test results. Then Rob looked at the full newspaper page. Both of us caught on at once. Wow, I said, a method of disposal. That must be sales, but what a crazy way to put it. And look at this, Rob said, holding up the item in one hand and the full page on the other. Election day sales or values is printed in black headlines at the top of both sides of the page. And gubernatorial applies because the elections for New York State governor on November 9. I'd also say that the phrase election day sales is certainly in the vernacular. Refer to the illustrated section of the reproductions of the test item and the page from which it was torn. Both sides of the test item contain portions of advertisements that were tied in with election day, yet the words election day didn't appear on the object itself at all, only on the whole newspaper page that had lain on a high shelf of Rob's studio bookcase. But why didn't Seth just say sales? I asked in exasperation. Listen, Rob said, laughing, we have to go along with the way the data comes through and try to learn from it. You did well. Now, I think that this is an excellent example of the way extrasensory perceptions are sometimes received. Sales are a method of disposal, yet verbally the final connection isn't as concise as we would like. There's more than just the idea of conciseness involved, though. Such answers are also just different, unexpectedly so, and they make us consider old objects or ideas in new and equally valid ways. I'll have more to say about this sort of thing later in this chapter. There were quite a few other surprises in this test. Not only did Seth pick up this excellent identifying information, but he gave further impressions concerning the whole page from which the test item had been taken. Besides all the sales, there were 4 articles on the large section. The envelope item didn't include these, yet Seth gave impressions referring to 3 of them. A mission with unforeseen consequences, 1943. Ilia, and perhaps an F and R. Something happening all over again as a commemoration. A connection with something green as a meadow, a child. Januarius. All of this referred to as an article dealing with a Dominican seminary founded in Aldeia Nova, Portugal in 1943. We believe Ilia, an attempt to get at Aldeia. The given date was correct, and the article goes on to tell about a young priest, Father Fernandez, F and R, the abbreviation for father is FR, who was on a mission in this country to get funds to modernize the seminary. He was also described as organizing a pilgrimage to commemorate the 50th anniversary celebration at Fatima, which is only 10 miles from the seminary. The article states that the seminary includes, among other things, its own farm, vineyards, and vegetable and fruit gardens. We think that the green as meadow impression referred to these. The Januarius connection didn't seem to be related. Yet it is highly important for me because for me personally, it had a strong religious connotation. One of my favorite grade school teachers was a nun, Sister Januarius. The article speaks of the 3 children who saw the apparition at Fatima, and Seth mentioned a child. Other impressions dealt with another article headline, Portugal shows dip in prisoners. This specifically referred to the need to modernize the big old antiquated prisons that were of very low standard and made several remarks concerning the crime rate in Portugal. The article also stated that Portugal has the lowest per capita income in Europe. Seth's impressions were fairly obvious here. Connection with a monstrosity, as of a monstrous building, a disturbance, a determination and a disadvantage, an inadequate performance. Seth also gave some other impressions of the page from which the envelope item was taken. Besides dealing with the articles, a date above, buttons, some figures, and a distant connection with skull shapes, the colors, blue and purple and green, and other round shapes. The date of the paper was at the top of the page, of course. Buttons, many of them, were clearly shown in the photographs of clothing for sale. These same models are also the figures Seth mentions. And as you can see from the photograph of the page, the women's faces gave a skull-like impression with their hair pulled back. The colors mentioned by Seth are listed in the sheet advertisement. Purple, I believe, refers to orchid mist. This date brought several questions to mind at once, though. How had Seth picked up the information about the entire page when only a small section of it was in the test envelope? Had some kind of projection on my part been involved back to the studio bookcase? Seth hadn't first given impressions of the envelope object itself, then neatly moved on to deal with the entire page. He had shifted back and forth between the two, as if viewing both at once. And why had he not confined his data just to the envelope object? We asked Seth about these points in a later session and got some very interesting answers. A portion is always connected to the whole for which it is part, he says. From the torn section, then, to me, the whole page was present, and from portions of the whole can be read. With enough freedom on one hand and training on the other, Rupert, speaking for me, could give you the entire copy of the New York Times from a torn corner. This does not involve projection. There were other issues having to do with Rupert's own characteristics. Now it is true, generally speaking, that material of an emotional nature actually has a stronger vitality and is easier to perceive. Beyond this, however, Rupert has no love for detail. Seth smiled and will always use it as a clue to see where it leads them. He would not be content simply to give the details on the snatch of paper. This is a fairly automatic tendency of his mental life. We use it, I hope, to advantage in our sessions in other ways. In the tests, however, we tried to utilize this characteristic. Once we could not deny it. Rupert's abilities are what I have to work with, and though, besides, of course, my own. So we use this tendency here to enlarge the picture and bring in further details that gave you rather respectable data, and in a way that was fairly natural to Reuben. About the tests in general, Seth said, I was teaching him, and I went along with his natural interests and inclinations. The antagonism he had for testing came not from the idea itself, as much as from the idea of focusing upon detail for detail's sake. For only when you had that kind of a test did he become antagonistic. In extrasensory perception, as in so-called normal perception, the natural inclinations of the personality dictate the kind of information that would be sought from any available field of data. There are many areas of knowledge in which any given individual is uninterested. He will not bother me to use even normal perception to obtain it. I gave Rupert access to large fields of focus. I help him change the energy that he uses in perception into other directions to turn it inward. I make information available to him. Then, according to his basic characteristics, he uses the information. The test just described stress clairvoyance. An earlier test was extremely illuminating from a different standpoint, convincing us that the original extrasensory perception is general, like an overall view of a large area. Somewhere, a narrowing down process must occur to give it a more specific focus. The test was funny, really, because Seth was doing beautifully on his own. Then he threw the ball to me, and I nearly fell flat on my face. The envelope item was a bill of Rob's dated July 15th, 1966. The session was on August 1st. I'd been with Rob at the lumber yard when he got the bill. See the illustrated section. Illustrated section. I wonder what that is. Oh, okay. I see some pictures here. Let me see here. Okay, so this is the, I think this is the receipt that he was talking about, or Jane was talking about. Let's see, for session 276, the test envelope contained this bill. Note the line overhanging the name Glenn M. Schuler. For details, see chapter 8. Note the line overhanging the name. This one here. Oh, amount. Okay, amount of transaction, cell number, and date. So down here, it says, thank you. We appreciate your patronage. And if there's anything about this bill or the goods that is not correct, please report the same to us and we will gladly make it right. This is our way of doing business and we want to give you continue as, and we want to have you continue as one of our customers. Glenn M. Schuler. 150 carload storage at your service and modern machinery to manufacture and mix feeds to your order. Interesting. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Let me go back that. Let me go back to that. Okay, let's see where we're at. All right. Rob had purchased 2 4x8 foot pieces of masonite and roller pan. The salesman who waited on us became quite talkative when he learned that Rob was going to use the masonite for paintings. He told us that a European artist had done a portrait of him while he'd been a soldier in World War II. Somewhat humorously, he described how the artist had drawn his face as though it were symmetrical and without blemish. Well, actually, it was quite asymmetrical with an impaired eye. The salesman also wore glasses. Here are some of Seth's impressions. 4 square or 4 and 4 square. We thought this was very good. Rob had the 2 pieces of masonite cut in half so they'd fit into our car. This gave him 4 pieces, each 4 foot square. Writing or printing on the lower left-hand corner, very small, holding the object horizontally. Something on the back also. Both of these applied, except that the very small print was on the left side, not only the left corner. 1966, looking forward to 1967. Written on the bill is the date of the year, 1966, and underneath, account forwarded. A connection with a photograph or other like object. This, we believe, refers quite validly to the portrait. An oval shape or eye shape, that is this kind of an eye inside of a rectangle or triangle, you see. According to Rob's notes, I pointed to one of my own closed eyes. The salesman, as mentioned earlier, specifically mentioned his poor eye in connection with his portrait and his glasses. Connection with transportation and with water. A rather unique way of referring to a 10-mile car trip to Wellsburg. The name of the town appears on the bill, so instantly does the word car load on the back. A word beginning with M and another M, capital M, this time the initial of a name. Rob had purchased masonite by its brand name, but the salesman listed it as Predswood on the bill. A capital M appears in the bill's heading, Glenn M. Schuyler. A rectangular item with some dark coloring on it, perhaps dark blue. The bill is rectangular. The back of it is printed in heavy black. All in all, Seth gave 24 impressions. Each of them did apply, though some were not as specifically connected as others. For example, Seth said, connection with black, symbolic of death, and with a tournament against symbolic as of a crossing of swords. We believe that this was a reference to World War II. When the salesman who waited on us had his portrait done as a soldier. Another example was this, numbers, perhaps 01913. The bill did not have numbers on it, and in a series that began with 0, this seemed unusual to us, but not in the order given by Seth. One series begins with 09, not 019, and the last 2 digits, 1 and 3, do appear by themselves on the front of the bill. Up to this point, the impressions had come through with no concern on my part. I was in a deep trance. Then Seth said, the feeling of something hanging over, threatening or overhanging on the upper half of the object, and dark. As I spoke these words for Seth, a rift seemed to open up, a doubt as to the information's interpretation. I knew that Seth wanted me to narrow this down myself and that this was part of my training. I had the feeling of something very heavy hanging over me. Was this to be translated into an object, like, say, a heavy roof over my head, or to an emotional feeling that hung over me? I didn't know. And at that point, I couldn't figure it out. The correct specific connection wasn't made. Seth threw me another, something bright and small also, beneath this overhanging or threatening portion. Again, left to my own devices, I couldn't work my way to the specific data we wanted. Yet Seth was trying to lead me to the word roofing. It was in the head of the bill on the upper half. See how correct and yet ambiguous that unfinished impression was? The feeling of something hanging over, threatening or overhanging on the upper half of the object, and dark. The second impression that I was supposed to complete, something bright and small beneath this overhanging or threatening portion, was to lead me to the word roller pan, which also appeared on the bill beneath the word roofing. A roller pan is small, bright, and shiny, and the one Rob purchased that day had been a shiny aluminum color. Here, Seth's impressions had been quite literal, as if the words on the bill were coming to life and being described as objects instead of as words describing objects. Later, I was to do much better when Seth left some impressions up to me, but this kind of training was invaluable. Even though I didn't do a very good job, we learned something about the nature of perception, which was Seth's intent. This test made us suspect that all impressions, extrasensory or otherwise, are initially nonverbal and non-visual, rather like pure feeling that is only later interpreted in sense terms. We tried all sorts of things with the envelope. In the New York Times test, Rob himself didn't know what was on the test object. He didn't always know what the test object was, in any case, and sometimes he didn't even know what a test object would be held. Sometimes he didn't even know that a test would be held. For example, occasionally friends would come unannounced to a session and bring their own test envelope. This was just handed to me in the middle of the session without my knowing beforehand whether or not a test would be held. Sometimes Rob would use such an envelope at once. At other times, he would save it for future session. It didn't seem to make any difference in the results whether Rob knew what the test envelope contained or not. One night, Nora Stevens, not her real name, came unannounced. She was the friend of a friend and had attended 2 sessions previously. During this period, we encourage people to drop in with test envelopes, though actually few did. Before and after this, we preferred to keep our sessions private. We knew that Nora was a secretary in a hospital office that had to do with the purchase of drugs and supplies, but that she had nothing to do with patients, their records, or medical procedures. I didn't know she'd bought an envelope. She slipped it to Rob after the session began. Seth said a connection with a family record as a page, for example, from a book, connected also with the turbulent event of unpleasantness. 4 numbers in a row and other numbers, the initial capital M, a connection with another city. After the session, we opened the envelope. It contained a patient's record sheet, a page from a pad that Nora had picked out of a wastebasket in another office. At the bottom corner were 4 numbers in a row, with other numbers on the top by the patient's name, Margaret. Her hometown also began with an M. She was from out of town. A hospital stay is certainly unpleasant, often turbulent. Seth also gave other impressions concerning the woman's background, but we couldn't check these out. Yet sometimes I get discouraged, even over good results. One test had pleased me no end at first. It was our 37th, held in the 237th session on March 2nd, 1966. The target item was a print Rob had taken of his own hand a week earlier when we were reading some books on palmistry. Seth's impression couldn't have been more concise. I went around the house with a smile on my face, just thinking of it for days afterward. I was doing dishes when a drawback suddenly occurred to me. Rob was in the living room. I went in slowly. I bet Dr. Instream would throw out results of that handprint test because we both worked on palmistry the week before, I said. He might, Rob admitted, but the fact is we'd received plenty of letters that I could have used since then. We also did work on handwriting analysis. I could have used one of those samples. I could have used something older than you are, as I've done before. I could have used anything. No matter what we use, Seth still has to describe a particular item. And those impressions weren't general. They could only refer to that specific handprint. I agreed with him. But after that, Rob often made up several test envelopes at once, shuffled them, and then chose one just before a session. And what about the Instream tests? First of all, I kept waiting to hear what Dr. Instream thought about my 2 out-of-body episodes, but he simply never mentioned them. To me, this was terribly disappointing. The results had checked out, whether or not they could be considered scientific. If these didn't convince him that something was going on, I didn't see what would. The overall results of our own envelope test encourage us to hope that Seth was doing fairly well on a regular Instream data. 2, we started these with zeal and energy. For 1 year, twice a week, Seth gave his impressions as to Dr. Instream's activities. These included specific references as to names, initials, dates, and places. Some of this data could be easily checked out. Dr. Instream wanted Seth to concentrate on naming a particular object, though upon which he would be concentrating in the distant town in which he lived. It became obvious that the emotional elements were more important, that activities of an emotional nature came through more clearly than impressions of a more neutral object. Seth did give material pertaining to objects also, but he was more apt to give specific information on Dr. Instream's daily life. One of our favorite topics of conversation that year was, when will we hear from Dr. Instream? For months on end, we would hear nothing. Perhaps we thought he wanted to give us no reports until the experiments were finished. If so, why didn't he just tell us? When finally the suspense was too much for me, I would write. Were we getting any hits or weren't we? Dr. Instream always assured us of his continuing interest, told us to go on with the tests, and said that he had no evidence yet strong enough to convince the hard-nosed psychologists. But that was all. He said nothing about the numerous names and dates, the visitors or letters mentioned in the sessions. Was the data all wrong? Partially right? We never found out. He never told us. Knowing that Dr. Instream would be concentrating on each session put me under a strain, perhaps because of my own attitude. But now I felt that I really had to have a session each Monday and Wednesday evening, come hell or high water. And even when we were alone, which we usually were, I felt that the sessions were no longer private, that an invisible Dr. Instream was an audience. We seldom missed a session before the Instream tests, but now my idea of great defiance was to miss a session, to go out and get a beer and let the psychologist go stare at his old face or ink spot or whatever he'd chosen for that night's test. I didn't feel this way in the beginning, but I was really furious that he didn't tell us the results of the tests. All those hours seemed to be going down the drain. One night, really angry at not hearing from him, I did go with Rob to a nearby bar, only to rush home at the last minute so as not to miss the session. With no idea of how we were doing, I couldn't have cared less, finally, what Dr. Instream was concentrating on. The test just became time-consuming, cutting down on the amount of theoretical material we could receive. Once more, I wrote the good doctor, suggesting that he not spare my feelings in case the data was just wrong. If so, we were wasting his time and our own. Again, he wrote of his continuing interest and suggested we keep on. But he would not say we were doing well, fair, or poorly, and he gave no reports on the many specific details given. He was obsessed with statistical. He was obsessed with statistical proof, the tongue twister there, for the existence of telepathy and clairvoyance, and hoped that we could produce it. At first, it seemed tremendously exciting to me to be a part of such an endeavor. But as we continued to read everything we could get our hands on, excitement turned to bewilderment. As far as we could tell, the existence of telepathy and clairvoyance had been scientifically proven time and again by Dr. J.B. Ryan at Duke University and demonstrated by others such as Croisset, a psychic, working with Professor Willem Tenhoff at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. The work of Harold Sherman and other psychics certainly added circumstantial evidence at the very least. Was Instream throwing out all of these results and countless other evidence gained in parapsychology laboratories throughout the world? Apparently he was, and our own results were presenting difficulties. Dr. Instream admitted that he didn't know how to evaluate them statistically. A hit had to have so many known odds against it before it could be credited, and it was nearly impossible to set up odds against any particular statement made by Seth. Seth told Dr. Instream he would be moving to a Midwestern university by the end of the year, for example. I have no idea if Dr. Instream had any indication of this ahead of time, but he did move when Seth said he would, and to a Midwestern university. We never learned how many correct impressions, even of this sort, checked out. Enough of them would have added up to something. So would a high enough percentage of hits on specific names and dates and so forth, statistics or no. We started all the ESP tests just before our friends, the Gallaghers, took their 1965 vacation. In the meantime, they took another trip, and we decided to try the same kind of experiment with them as we had earlier. This time, Peg and Bill went to Nassau. Again, neither Rob nor I had been there. Again, we exchanged no cards, letters, or communications of any kind. And to my delight, Seth certainly knew where the Gallaghers were staying. In a series of impressions one night, October 7, 1966, he accurately described the hotel. A building with a long, narrow section. A roof supported by posts. The roof is long and narrow also, with a floor of stone or cement, sand-colored. A veranda outside their door, a large bucket filled with sand. There are rocks beneath the veranda, and beyond that, the ocean or bay. Right at the shore, down and ahead, is a scooped-out circular indentation where there is a swift current because of the rocks. And at this particular point, by this indentation, there is no beach, though there is a beach to the left and right, rather large ones. Each point was correct. We went over the material with the Gallaghers on their return. But there was much more. Seth had correctly described a nightclub they'd visited, then went on to mention that there had been a nuisance there. Bill and Peg wholeheartedly agreed. They'd been annoyed by a loud-mouthed English tourist, so obviously had others. The Englishman insisted upon whistling with the band. Seth also said that there were 18 shrubs out in front of the nightclub, but Bill had to admit that though there were shrubs out front, he hadn't thought of counting them. Seth seemed to pick up things that had particular emotional meaning for Peg and Bill. For instance, he included, among other impressions, a commemoration of a murder, a statue. It developed that the Gallaghers had passed a statue, a memorial to Sir Harry Oakes, who had been murdered in a sensational, well-publicized case in 1943. Peg was so curious about this that she even questioned a cab driver on his knowledge of the murder events. Then, strangely, Seth gave a very specific description of a place Peg and Bill visited, but with one distortion. apparently of wording. A fountain with steps leading up to it, a circular formation surrounded by flowers with closely crowded old two-story structures to the left of the street and very close to it in rows. Everything was correct, except that there was a water tower rather than a fountain. As told, a total of 40 correct impressions were given in the 3 sessions held, while Peg and Bill were in Nassau. More, actually, since many impressions consisted of several points. But so much work is involved in such an experiment. Memory is valuable, so we always try to get anyone involved to write up their reports at once for easier and more reliable checking. In any case, I always think of that testing year as beginning with the Gallaghers trip to Puerto Rico and ending with their Nassau trip. As far as we were concerned, Seth had proven himself. After a year's work, we wrote to Dr. Instream, ending the test and giving our reasons. After a few more envelope tests, we ended those too. Actually, I'm not sorry that we took so much time for the test, but I'm glad we ended them when we did. I'm not temperamentally suited to putting myself under fire twice a week, which is what I was doing with the attitude I had at the time. Emotionally, I disliked the tests. Intellectually, I thought them necessary. Seth didn't seem to mind them at all, but I forced myself to go along because I thought I should. The fact remains that in our sessions, the best instances of ESP have occurred spontaneously or in response to someone's need, and not when we were trying to prove something. I knew I was disappointed not to get some sort of certificate of legitimacy from Dr. Instream. On the other hand, we didn't ask for one. We were too burned up not to have reports on the results. Now we could concentrate on the Seth material. Freed from the test structure, the sessions were ready to go places. We were in for many surprises. If I had more faith in Seth's abilities and my own, I would have saved myself a lot of trouble. Actually, even while we were conducting the ESP tests, other things were happening and not only in sessions. Very shortly after the sessions began, Rob started to see visions or images. Some were subjective, but others were objectified, 3-dimensional or nearly so. Some were of people, and Rob began to use them as models for his paintings. Now our living room is full of portraits of people we don't know. Seth has said that some depict ourselves in past lives. One used in this book is a portrait of Seth in the form in which he chose to appear to Rob. Since then, and a friend of ours have both seen Seth as he appears in this picture. Rob has a strong visual memory. Once he sees such an image, he retains it and can refer back to it at will. My visual memory is poor in contrast, and so is my eyesight. I have no depth perception. Rob is a professional artist, an excellent draftsman and technician. Yet in sessions, Seth has given Rob excellent advice and information on the techniques and philosophy of art. This strikes us as really funny since I paint as a hobby with a stubborn lack of perspective. Rob used to try to teach me perspective, but the lessons just wouldn't take. I've never studied art, and my paintings are rather childish in execution, done with raw color. Yet Seth told Rob how to mix and use certain pigments, and Rob has added the information to his repertoire. Seth said that he has no artistic ability either, but questions artists who have entered his own field of reality. In one session, Seth gave some pointers that Rob immediately put to use. The picture is one of our favorites and belongs to Rob's People series, portraits of people we've never met. The inspiration for this particular painting came to Rob suddenly a few days after the session in question, and he used the techniques Seth had given in his execution. Here are a few excerpts from that session. In a portrait, Seth said, "Do the same exercise as given earlier. That is, imagine the individual as the center of all life, so that when the painting is completed, it automatically suggests the whole universe of which the individual is part. Nothing exists in isolation. And this is the secret that the old masters knew so well. In the smallest detail, they managed to suggest the reality of the spiritual universe, of which that detail was a part, and through which the energy of the universe spoke. Use your talents, and they are considerable to this end. You can do no less. Now, oil suggests the earth. Let that medium stand for the physical appearance of permanency in any object, the physical continuity of any given human form in painting. Let the transparent oil colors represent the constant renewal of energy that always escapes the form. One of our attractions of your portrait of me is that of automatically suggest an unseen audience to whom I appear to be speaking. Not a formal audience, but unseen listeners who represent humanity at large. The unseen is here. The unseen is there. The figure manages to suggest the universe of men and the world that holds them, yet nowhere do these appear. Now, this information is from an artist who always used siennas for initial flesh tones, with a suggestion very lightly of violets. These were then very cleverly built up with a transparent orchard, which he had, and a particular green, muted. The top complexion tone lay on this lightly, as if the wind could blow it away. After the session, Rob told me he was quite certain that I didn't consciously possess such knowledge, that my mind didn't work that way. Rob had never tried this particular method of building up color tones in portrait work, and it is this technique he used in the painting idea that came to him a few days after this session. Later, Seth added to this information. We're still accumulating material on art philosophy, and painting techniques. Seth has dropped some hints as to the identity of the artist who is passing on this data to him. According to what he said so far, the artist was a 14th century Dane or Norwegian and was known for his domestic scenes and still lifes. We have been told that his name will come in future sessions, along with other information on art. Seth did say, however, that Rob's picture using the color building technique is a portrait of the artist in question. See illustrated section. Wonder. I don't see it. Oh, okay. Interesting. So this is McDonald. We didn't read about that. This is Robert Butt's portrait of Seth. Two of Jane's students have also visualized Seth in this form. So this is kind of what Seth looks like right here. A bold old guy, eh? Okay. I don't think I see the painting. Okay, so we're talking about the Dane or Norwegian. Well, let's read on and see what happens. Okay. Seth did say, however, that Rob's picture using the color building technique is a portrait of the artist in question. See illustrated section. He also said that Rob would do other paintings of both the artist and his environment, including possibly the artist's studio. In the past, Rob's portraits were representatives of personalities involved with us personally through association or past life connections, as far as we know. Some of them still have to be identified. Lately, however, the range of the portraits has been extended. Rob did one of the young man recently, for example, see illustrated portrait section. He had no idea who it was. Later, one of my students, George, picked out the painting as a portrait of a personality called Vega, who communicates with him through automatic writing. So we have a picture of Bega here. Here it is. Another of Rob's vision portraits. This is one of Bega, a personality who communicates through one of Jane's students via automatic writing. That's Bega right there. Okay, so this guy here, Rob's painting of the 14th century artist from whom Seth gleans advice on painting and techniques. So this is the guy that was Norwegian, or what did he say? Or Dane, 14th century Dane or Norwegian. That's the artist with the techniques. Interesting, eh? Another bald guy. Huh. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Seth corroborated this and said that Bega is one of his own students in another level of reality. Though the sessions continued as usual, we found ourselves having other experiences then, like Rob's visions, that also developed out of the Seth material in one way or another. And as if to stress our new sense of freedom and further add to my confidence and training, Seth was to send me to California during a session, while he and Rob talked in the living room of our apartment in Elmira, New York. So much more fun than trying to tell the contents of sealed envelopes. This time, complete strangers were involved in an experience that would really satisfy my seemingly endless search for proof after proof. End of chapter 8. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. We will continue with chapter 9 next week. And I hope the camera is clear or clearer so you can read. Anyways, I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you again next Monday. Bye-bye now.